Right. Good morning. It's Sunday morning and it's a beautiful day here in Durban, South Africa. I'm so happy to be with you. We've come to the end to our last series, The Oldest Myth in the Bible. And today we're going to start something new. Within the last month or two, I've started putting some ideas to paper, trying to write a little bit more concise articles that 3 to 5 minute reads that quite easily can convey an important message. And to some degree, these articles are kind of like my journey over the last 4 or 5 years since I've been studying the Bible from a more neutral or critical perspective. And I thought it'd be a good idea to take some of those articles that are currently out. They're out on Substack, and the Substack is called Dogma Detox. So you can find it. I'll put the link in the bottom here. But what I would like to do over the next couple of weeks is spend a bit of time on going through each of these articles and expanding on them a little bit here in these normal weekly videos. I normally release one there every Sunday, so it probably is popped up at 10:30. You can subscribe there and it'll come straight to your inbox, or you can go find them there every week if you're enjoying them. So this will be a little bit more of a personal touch for me. I'm going to get a little bit personal about this journey and the things that I've landed on. I by no means feel that I understand everything or know everything. In some ways, it's easier to understand what is not than what is. And to some degree, this is what this process has been for me. It's been and still is and continues to be a discovery of what is not. And it's kind of, the old example of someone, Michelangelo, taking a big piece of marble and slowly starting to chip off the pieces that do not look like David. And it's kind of like that, I guess. I'm busy chipping away at the things that are unnecessary, they are not, and trying to get to what is. All right. So I'm going to be referring to the very first article I wrote about a month or 5 weeks or so ago, and it's called I've Changed My Mind About the Bible. And today I would like to walk through that article here in this video, expand a little bit on it, and give a little bit more details on the spirit behind the article. These conclusions that I've come to are not easy to get to for me. One of the first things I deal with in the article is basically my own history. I'm going to talk like nobody knows me because most people don't. But I know there are some people that obviously have followed us that are going to find this information not very surprising. But I kind of grew up in the 80s, 90s in a fundamentalist Christian Pentecostal tradition, the AFM. My dad was a pastor from the first day that I was born. And so I was born into a family, a very good family. I have very good parents. My dad has passed away about 13 or 14 years ago, but my mom's still alive, and I've been very blessed with a very, very good family. We've had a wonderful childhood. In that sense, I am very, very thankful for that. But the reality is that we grew up in a very staunch Pentecostal environment. Now, if you don't know what staunch Pentecostalism looks like, I'm sure you could find some churches still today around here, but just to give you a quick idea, it was rather strict. As kids, we were not really allowed to socialize too much with people outside of our church. We weren't allowed to go to parties really at school because dancing, the big sins of humanity was dancing, swearing, smoking, and drinking. And so those things were just not done. They weren't done really. The people in the church that did them behind closed doors. But for us as a family, these things were not secretively done. They were just completely out of bounds, and that's how we grew up with them. The Pentecostal environment is a very, very strict environment. At the same time, it's an environment that differs from the Reformed environment by this, that it believes in the charismata, in the gifts of the Spirit, and that obviously makes things a little bit more interesting, and that's not really a topic for today. But I grew up as a pastor's kid, and that is to a very large degree had formed me in the way that I was thinking about the world, and I was thinking about myself and everything around me. What I didn't realize at the time is that it was very much a bubble, um, a Bible bubble to some degree, because we spend most our time in a type of an echo chamber, in a place where everybody was kind of saying the same things at church, and we spent a lot of time in church, 2, 3, 4 times a week at Bible study, youth, church morning, Sunday evening. So a lot of it is just regurgitation of the same ideas, and the more, if you say them with more fervor, you are considered someone with more faith, and people look up to you. And the pastor was this type of figure within the community, and of course, we looked up to my dad, and he was a wonderful man. Um, but one of the sacred things about this community, and I'm sure it's true for other communities as well, but I'm just going to speak of my own experience, is the Bible. The Bible, it was almost viewed like, although obviously we knew that humans wrote the Bible was almost viewed like the way that Muslims view the Quran. It's like a book that is a download of revelation, almost like it fell out of heaven. Like nobody really typically believed that it kind of fell out of heaven, and nobody really does. But we treated it like it in fact did. Um, and so there were a couple of things that were absolute non-negotiables, and one of them was the way that we treated, the way we looked at, and the way that we read the Bible. The Bible was probably one of the most sacred things. Some people joke about this and say that it was the fourth partner in the Trinity, which, of course, there wouldn't be a Trinity anymore. But although the Bible actually explicitly speaks about Jesus as the Word of God, for us, the Bible was the Word of God, and it was a direct word from God. Although it was written by humans, it had to be treated as if God Himself uttered every single word um, that was written down in our Bibles. Of course, only our Bible, not the Bible of the Catholics or the Egyptian Coptics. Or the Orthodox Church. Only our Bible was authoritative, um, and so this was one of the most sacred things. And I think something I've come to realize over the last 3 or 4 years is that a lot of Christians, although they say they base their Christianity in their experience of God, which would include church services, personal religious experiences, prayer time, etc., it is all undergirded. The moment you really ask someone, how do you know that what you believe here about this X, Y, Z is true? They'll always bring you back to the Bible, that the Bible says. Um, and so this was really a massive anchor and a foundation for us as kids growing up. As Protestant kids, I think to some degree, this idea of sola scriptura, which was really a product of the Protestant Reformation in the 1600s, the Catholics don't really hold to this, um, was the foundation of our religion. It was the foundation of our worldview. It was the foundation of how we would treat people. Um, so we didn't really, we were not really too much interested in science, except for when you're writing your science exam. We didn't really care too much about psychology. Going to a psychologist was an absolute no-no for us because the Bible has the answers to all the problems. So there's no need for psychologists. They'll just lead you in the wrong direction. And although we all never really spoke ill of doctors, it was frowned upon to go to doctors when you have a problem, because what you should be doing is you should just be praying for your problem, and then it's going to go away. And so we don't really need the doctors so much. It's one of the things I kind of remember about my dad, not really wanting to go to doctors when he got sick. But later in his years, the doctors really saved him from cancer in one case. And then he finally succumbed to motor neuron disease, which no one could save him from. So these type of things, psychologists, science, in the forms of just astronomy, etc., microbiology, all of that, it was there, and we would learn it for. I went to university. maths, and we'd learn all these disciplines, but just to write the test. Ultimately, the Bible had all the answers for everything, and so it was also then in some ways with doctrines and the excuse me, doctors. So one of the fundamental things I grew up with is that there was no discussion or debate about whether the Bible was true. I can never, as a kid, remember, or as a teenager, I mean, really, even up into, I went on to become a pastor in 2004 and was the leader of a normal type of a charismatic church for about 18 years. I can never actually remember going to church or talking to anyone in the church that said, "But is this actually true? Did this actually happen?" It just wasn't our environment. Our environment was not um, shaped to allow people to ask questions in this way. It was just an undergirding substructure that no one ever questioned. Every word in the Bible was true, spoken by God. Yes, written by people, but that wasn't the important part. It came straight from the mouth of God. There was no discussion, there was no debate. And if anybody would show any doubt, that would not be regarded as a good or positive thing, because doubt was the absolute enemy of faith. And as we moved on from Pentecostalism into the charismatic era, the word of faith movement had a huge influence, I think, on our psyche, on the way that we treated life. I think my dad was a strong proponent of this to some degree, but so was most charismatic churches, and you'll find them down for a dozen around you at the moment still, where the word of faith movement, the kind of a prosperity. God wants to heal everything and fix everything all the time. You just have to believe enough. That's pretty much all over the place. At least it's a type of faith also that is very prominent on TV. So someone who was saying, but I'm not sure this actually works, those people never voiced any opinions. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it was an echo chamber of just this idea of the Bible being true 100%, no problems, no mistakes, direct word of God is not something I ever heard questioned. Nobody ever stood up and said, but I don't think this is true. It might have happened everywhere else, but it definitely didn't happen in our circles. And because we isolated ourselves to some degree, it wasn't something I was ever really exposed to. So by the time that I was 13 years old, for instance, this was already baked into me. You could call it indoctrination, whether positive or negative, it doesn't matter. But by that time, before I reached critical age, an age where I could really apply myself in critical thinking, this was already part of me. And so it's to be honest, for most of my life, it never even dawned on me that it should at least be looked at. It was just an absolute given. So by the time I learned to think for myself around the 90s when I was a teenager, that was pretty much part of who we were and how we thought. And it wasn't because we were all stupid people. This is something which I'm also realizing, that people that are indoctrinated to a lesser or a larger degree in good things or bad things, it's really got nothing to do with their intellect, but by the repetition of the exposure to these ideas. You can find the most intelligent people completely indoctrinated. Um, they're kind of independent in some way. Um, I wasn't a stupid kid. I did well at school. I did engineering at university. My reasoning abilities were not half bad, but it just, when it came to the Bible, it never even crossed my mind to ask whether an actual flood ever happened, or whether Adam and Eve were two real people. And so many more examples that I can mention here today, which is not really the point of this discussion. When it came to the Bible, it was like my critical thinking faculties were completely shut down. Not only because of peer pressure, it wasn't only because of peer pressure. In fact, it was largely just somehow they were disconnected because of the way I grew up. So here I want to get to a little bit more structured part of the article, which I would like to discuss today. There were basically three indisputable facts that I never heard these terms. I only later on realized that I actually hold to these facts, these axioms. I hold to them without knowing that I hold to them. And there might be some of you watching here today and say, and you might never even have considered any of these, and you might not even think that you hold to them, but on further inspection, I realized that I'm actually an absolutist. I'm an absolute adherent to these three ideas. And I'm going to mention to them these three to you. And then I'm going to discuss them very, very briefly. And then my later discussions in the next videos, I want to take each one of these three and spend the whole session on each one of them, a session for each, because they're important enough to do this. So these were the three, you can call them axioms, principles, whatever you want, rules, laws, whatever you want to call it, that nobody ever questioned as a kid, as I grew up, and even in my time as a pastor. It took a very, very long time, I would say at least 15 years, before at some point I started realizing, um, I don't think this actually happened like the Bible said it did. And then, of course, it opens up the doors to, okay, maybe this is metaphorical, and this is poetry and so on. And I guess to that degree, I was a proponent later on of someone who I think it's understood to be complementarianism to some degree, where I know the Bible says this and reality looks like that, but the Bible is mostly metaphorical, and therefore it still contains the truth of reality. I spent a lot of my time there, but I had to be very careful, because as a pastor, changing the way you think about the Bible can cost you some very dear friendships, can cost you your livelihood, and a lot of pain and suffering. And so, I can uh, sympathize with pastors who start to see things differently, but they are unable to really talk about these things. And even until today, I find very small spaces where I can actually talk freely about the things that I'm becoming aware of. Now, this little setup here of mine, putting a video out once a week, is one of the places where I can, and where I've become brave enough to say what I truly feel, what I have learned, etc. Um, and so, yeah, it's just not always that easy. So there are three things. Let me just add this. Someone asked me the other day, why are you doing this, Frans? Why are you spending your time sending out videos, writing articles? And I did think quite a long time about it, because I'm no longer a pastor that runs a church in the traditional sense. What I'm doing here, and what I'm doing in the writing of articles, and I spend hours and hours, sometimes per day, and on research and reading and investigating. It is an absolute. It's a little bit of an obsession. I think, kind of addicted to it, because the Bible is such a big part, has always been such a big part of my own life, the life of my family, and the life of my culture. I now find myself completely drawn to it, um, having to spend my time there. But I think one of the things I would like to say is that, because for so many years I had this particular view of the Bible, all of the teachings that I put forth came from that and was based on that particular view of the Bible. Now that I feel like my view of the Bible is shifting, I feel, what's the right word, obligated to put this out there, to correct some of the things I might have gotten wrong during my time I spent as a teaching pastor, if you want to call that. I wasn't any famous pastor by any stretch of the imagination, but I spent a lot of time in other countries preaching, teaching mostly, and of course in my own town, and with the people that I had relationship with for 15, 18 years, and some of them still continuing, um, twice a week teaching. So the point is just, I feel obligated to put out and in front of people, leave a record for those people, because many of them, obviously, they might never ever see this. Many of them don't follow me in that sense anymore. Um, But just so that, in the case that someone wants to know what happened to France, this is what happened to France. And I think more importantly than any of that is I want to leave a trail for my children. I don't want them to go back to where I started. I want them to continue the road and the path that I'm currently on. And this is why I just, out of love for the Bible, out of love for the actual mechanism of teaching, but also just out of respect and obligation for the people that sat in our ministry for so many years, and finally for the sake of the understanding of my children. Anyway, that's really personal, but I don't know why I got into that. Let me get back to the three axioms that I almost subconsciously accepted because of the way I was taught, and only later on became aware that this is in fact the way I do view the Bible. And then I started questioning these three things. So the first one is that the Bible is a book. This is the easiest one to transition from. But yeah, the Bible is a book. This is the first thing that I grew up with. When you go and you buy a Bible, it's, you know, it's pages between a nice leather um, cover, if you can afford such a Bible. It's the best-selling book of all time, and that's how you buy it, and that's how you think about it. We'll talk about that in a moment. The second axiom is this, that the Bible is univocal. What does univocal mean? Well, univocal kind of means that the Bible speaks with one voice at all times. I'm going to be exploring that a little bit today, so I don't want to say too much about it. So the Bible is a book. The Bible is univocal, uni meaning one, vocal meaning voice, one voice. And then lastly, the Bible is inerrant. So inerrancy means that there are no errors in the Bible. In other words, there are no errors in the Bible. The Bible is 100% infallible in the way that it puts information across to us. In other words, it cannot get any scientific thing wrong. It cannot get any historical event wrong. Um, it also can't contradict itself at all. And it has to get right everything that it says. In other words, everything the Bible actually says is 100% inerrant. Those are the three axioms that I think that most Protestant Christians hold to. There is a very large movement in the world today away from these three axioms, and I am a little bit late to this party. I think because I grew up quite isolated, and even while we were um, in ministry, our types of ministries were rather isolated. I mean, there were times when we were encouraged by our leaders not to fellowship too much with other churches, not to go to, what are these things called? Fraternities. In other words, isolation. If people want to talk to you, let them come to you. You know, you hold the meeting, you take charge of the meeting, and tell them what you believe. I think also because there came an era in our ministry where the leaders or the group that we belonged to started feeling like they had a better revelation than everybody else. Um, and so we kind of picked up on that. And as I'm sitting here now, I'm rather ashamed of that, that we could ever get to such a place. Um, I would now reject that type of idea that there is one special group somewhere that has a better knowledge than everybody else. Um, but it does seem like a lot of Christian movements do fall into that trap at some point, where their movement becomes monument-like and they settle around it and they close themselves off from moving forward or evolving in some sense. And then one of the byproducts of that is this type of exclusivism, where they believe that they know better than everybody else. And unfortunately, that path is the path towards cult, where all the most terrible Christian cults in the world have a couple of things in common: high control environments, um, terrible eschatologies that we write at the end, But the other thing they have in common is they believe they only have the real revelation um, about what's going on in the world and what's going to happen, etc., etc. A very apocalyptic view of the world in that sense. All right, now, right, let me get back to my article here. I went on to go and pastor myself 18 years. I spent 18 years teaching and studying the Bible. I remember very clearly when I started in ministry, I made the decision to only read the Bible for the first 10 years. Well, I didn't start off saying I'm only going to be reading the Bible, but I know that I did that for at least the first 10 years, meaning I didn't read any spiritual books. I tried not to read outside. I spent my time in the Bible as much as I could. And it was great. And I'm a rather logical type of person, systematic in the way that I approach things. And so I could strand things together and bring teachings that made sense and help people, I hope, in some way or the other. But all of these things were based on the fact that the Bible is a book, it's univocal and inerrant. Later on in my life, I started realizing that some of these teachings, they in fact don't work. I also started realizing that the fruit they were producing was not what we were expecting. And I got a little bit disillusioned because of that. And I started, that was the beginning of starting to reevaluate what I believe and what I'm doing as a pastor. Um, I applied myself to try and sincerely decipher, break open, teach the truth that was contained in the Bible. But during COVID afforded me something I never really had before the time, and that was time. I remember being stranded on a Estonian island called Saaremaa, I think, at the beginning of 2020. I was there for a conference, and I almost got stranded on that island. I think I took the last flight off it before all flights were cancelled. And I had to fly from Saaremaa to Estonia up to, yes, I'm pretty sure I went up into Sweden and then Finland, or Finland, then Sweden, then Dubai, and then back down South Africa. It took me like 2 days to get home. But it was during this time that I kind of came to a place where I realized I need to investigate a little bit better the historical context of the Bible. Um, anyway, COVID hit in full, and we were restricted. We lost our venue here in Durban North, and we continued with group meetings at my house. But during this time, because of COVID, had more time on my hands, and I started. I think I started with Andy Stanley's book. What is it called? Irresistible. And in Andy Stanley's book called Irresistible, I worked through it in multiple sessions. I realized that there was something wrong with the way that God was portrayed in the Old Testament. Now, this is not a new issue. Uh, these type of issues go all the way back into the very heart of Christianity. Case in point, maybe Marcion from the second century. But I started realizing there's something wrong with the way that God is portrayed in the Old Testament. Anyway, the point is, I then started reading. I started reading like an absolute madman, like I've never read in my life before. And I started reading outside of my tradition. I started reading outside charismatic Christianity. I started reading outside of apologetic circles. And I started reading scholarly work, basically, because I wanted to get a more neutral understanding of where the Bible comes from, what it does, etc., etc. I don't want to take too much time on all of this, but I also just want to convey my story to some degree. Right, so I spent about 5 years. It's been almost 5 years now, that I think it's about 4.5, but that I've spent reading. I have read myself into a couple of sets of spectacles. I think I've read over 100 books in the last 5 years, and that's besides all the other media that I've consumed, high-level debates that I would watch 2, 3, 4 times, uh, hundreds of them. I worked my way through textbooks. I really took time, and I say this quite liberally, that I spent more time studying this, the historical context of the Bible, than what I spent on my engineering degree, which I finished in 98, a 4-year course, and I did really well there. I spent a lot of time here. And so after all this time, I want to do these couple of videos because I want to put on record the things that I've come to understand um, after all of this time. Okay, so I put away my presuppositions of univocality, inerrancy, the Bible as a book, all my beliefs, I pushed them to the side and I started reading the Bible in its historical context, not trying to prove myself right. And this is what we normally do, Christians normally do when they approach the Bible in this type of study. They do it to prove themselves right. And so they pick up on any little piece of evidence that corresponds to their already held belief. And this confirmation bias can lead you down the same hole you came from. I tried to put that aside and I ended up in a different hole. Well, I wouldn't call it a hole, but I ended up in a different path. And I feel like I've moved on to some degree from some of the things that I've held for a very, very, very long time. But it was a stressful process because the church, the Bible is all I knew all my life. It created an existential crisis, not only of faith, but also of my own identity and the identity of my family. Um, Something I do not take very lightly, but the point is that it brought me to it. It was really stressful, really. It was actually painful. It was completely orientating, and it was it was definitely destabilizing in some sense. Um, and I could even use the word dark for some of the moments I experienced along the way. I realized that the way that I have led people as a pastor, I can't continue to do so without violating my own conscience and being a con man basically. Uh, in other words, what I'm saying is I couldn't go back and give people what I think they needed from me or what I was giving them before that. I just wasn't able to do that anymore. And in all good conscience, I decided not to go back to the worship service type of structure of church. Um, and to this day, just continue by throwing out teaching and working through ideas and trying to show what I have found. And I do have still some people coming to my house from time to time for Bible study and so on. But I'm no longer involved in church in that old sense that I was before. Eventually, I emerged from my cave, is what I wrote here, um, with some clarity, reading the Bible for what it said in its context and not my 21st century charismatic Christian context. It changed my life, and I am thankful for this. And this is why I have changed my view about the Bible. My conscience has compelled me, and I'm going to try and elaborate on this journey in my next couple of articles. You'll find them on Substack. There's about 5 of them out already, and I'll probably be about a month behind on these video sessions, just kind of elaborating, but I'll follow them chronologically to work through them. But it seems clear to me today that the Bible is in fact not a book. All right, let's talk about that. I've got not too much time left, so I just want to elaborate the concept a little bit, and then next week I'll probably do a whole session on why the Bible is not a book. Okay, so the Bible is not a book. It is a collection of writings, right? We all know that. And it's written over about the span of almost like 1,000 years. Like it's a very, very long time. Things change in 1,000 years. People change. People change the way they think, the way they live, the way they commune. The language changes. The idioms change. The metaphors change. The myths change. Beliefs change. And it's also written by different authors, many different authors. Most of them, we don't know who they are. And this is one of the startling realities I had to face. That in my Christian tradition I grew up in, we knew who every book was written by. There were maybe here and there something we might not have known, but every other book we knew. Like Moses wrote Genesis, and Peter wrote 1 Peter, and Paul wrote Hebrews, and Matthew wrote Matthew, and Solomon wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and Isaiah wrote all of Isaiah, and these are just things we took for granted. And on further inspection, it didn't seem to be all the same, which changes things. And this is true for the Old and the New Testament. These writings have contextual, historical layers that are folded in them, almost like a very good pastry. What was a puff pastry? When when you make puff pastry, you have the layer of dough and you put butter and dough, butter, dough, butter, dough, butter, and so you go on. The Bible is rather much more like this. It's a evaluated and redacted sayings, oral traditions, things that are written down, and it gets reworked in every new generation. And what we end up with is not exactly what Moses said, but we end up with an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation, etc., etc., etc. It's way more complicated than what we would like it to be. So the other thing is then obviously we just don't have the original manuscripts for much of the New Testament. I'm not even sure if we have anything from the New Testament, or for that fact the Old Testament. We have things that might be similar, but we don't have the originals. And these manuscripts from the original has been transmitted and redacted all the way down to what we actually do have. We don't have the original manuscripts, but we do have to depend on versions that are much later down the line of transmission. Now, the Bible is much better described as a library of ancient redacted texts. More about this next week. Then the second axiom was that the Bible is not univocal, meaning it does not speak with one singular and consistent voice. It has many voices because it has many authors, right? Even though we might not know who they are. And many of these authors or redactors lived in very different times, different contexts, different cultures that were very different from each other. Their political views different, their ideological views different, their theological views differ. The theological views of the post-exilic books of, for instance, Isaiah, are not the same as the theological views that we find in the writings of Paul or in the writings of the Gospels. They are not the same. They are many, many centuries apart, and things have progressed during this time. The fact that someone quotes them from a later time and reappropriates them for their now newer context does not mean that the initial two voices or that the early voice was saying and thinking the same thing as the later voices. These things can rather easily be shown. But this is something I just accepted all the way. In other words, the univocality means this, that there's one voice speaking all the time right throughout the Bible that believes all the same things. Therefore, the Trinity has to be found in the Old Testament. It has to be found in Genesis 1, where that's not really what's going on. The writer of 1 Genesis had absolutely no idea, and most definitely did not believe in a Trinity. And that's quite easy to show. And that a lot of the later stuff is re-engineering the old stuff for a later period. In fact, this might be the reason there are so many different interpretations in the first place. The Bible is not univocal on most important matters in it. If you just think about it for a moment, we have thousands of Christian denominations that believe very different things. And the reason for that is not because the Bible is univocal. It is, in fact, because it is not univocal. It says many different things at many different places about the same thing. That's why we have many different denominations. Unfortunately, one of the characteristics of Christianity is so exclusive that we even exclude our own if they don't believe exactly the way we believe. And in the old times, we were willing to kill for that difference. Lastly, the Bible is not inerrant. Now, this is the hardest one to face. This is the one that's caused me the most trouble and the most darkness. It might be the proposition that's the hardest to accept for any Christian, although it's common knowledge outside of Christianity. The authors of the Bible make mistakes. They often can contradict each other. The authors say two different things about the same thing. And that is exactly what we would expect of an ancient library written by different authors about the same subject. Once you part with this sacred predisposition of inerrancy, it actually becomes quite clear. So there's a huge barrier, and I've walked through that barrier, so that's what I want to talk about. There's a huge barrier for Christians before they can accept that the Bible is inerrant, because they feel like their whole existence, their whole system of belief, the truth of Jesus, the truth of God, salvation, heaven, hell, blah, 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 on and on and on, is all based on inerrancy. There's a large portion of Christianity for which they can't see through that. And for them to actually sit back and say, okay, I'm not going to assume it's inerrant and now go find and prove that it is, but to actually sit back and say, let me investigate from a neutral perspective whether it makes sense to say that the Bible has absolutely no errors in it. And if you could take that mental step, it's a very brave step to take. But if you are able to make that step and you start looking at the Bible from outside the Bible bubble, you start realizing, but this is just simply not true. And in 2 weeks from now, in this third session, the fourth session, I would like to spend some time on inerrancy, give you some examples, and maybe just let you in a little bit on my process of thinking through this. So once you part with this very deep-seated belief that you have, right, really from, if you grew up in the church, from a little kid, it is absolutely forced into you. And you're able to look from the outside, it actually becomes obvious that we can't expect such an amount of authorship, such a variety of authorship over basically over a millennium of writing, to actually say the same thing about everything. It doesn't make sense, and it's not what's going on in the Bible. Let me just, besides the reality that we cannot use the Bible as a science or a history textbook, because much of it is written phenomenologically and draws from its cultural and mythological ideas from its time, there's so much in the Bible that cannot be corroborated by archaeology. And archaeology is just one strand. And once again, you can't read apologists that believe Jericho's walls fell and then try and go find evidence for a falling wall. You got to read archaeologists that don't presuppose that the walls of Jericho fell, and then look at the evidence and say, if we didn't have the Bible, would we have concluded that there were massive walls that fell here? Just as an example, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying that's an example of how it should be approached. If you step outside of the biblical archaeological bubble and approach it from a neutral or an independent source, the picture changes quite a lot, and it's stepping through that barrier or through that bubble that is really, really hard and impossible for some people. They say impossible, it's just that they just never end up doing it. All right, so the reality is, especially when it comes to archaeology, much of the actual archaeological finds often we find that the Bible is exaggerating accounts, or there are some irreconcilable differences between the archaeological evidence and what the Bible actually tells us. Let me leave it at that. Well, the question is then finally today, where does this leave us as Christians? And look, I'm still figuring this out, but this is the real question, is if the Bible is not a book, it's a library, ancient, redacted. If it's not univocal, but it has many voices that say different things on the same ideas, and if it does in fact contain some exaggerations and mistakes and possibly even contradictions, where does it leave you as a Christian in your approach to the Bible? Well, for one, I can say that it has made me, the Bible intrigued me more than it's ever intrigued me, but I have to now be very careful of how I actually use it. Because to just unilaterally assume it inerrant, univocal, means I use it in a certain way, where now, as I've come to the conclusion that in fact it's not, I have to be careful of how I actually use it. In what way can we then also understand the inspiration of Scripture when we let go of these categorical errors that we've made for so long? Can a library of ancient texts that have so clearly the fingerprints of fallible men on it still be considered breathed by God or enlivened by God? And I do think so. But the mechanics of that, I'm not sure of. We need a new framework in that sense to look at the scriptures and approach the scriptures that have become so very dear to all of us. Lastly, I want to just say before I switch off here, these are open questions. I'm not coming in with answers for all these questions, but they do require honest scrutiny. There are many people that have been on this road much longer than what I have been. I feel like I'm a Johnny come lately in here, and I feel stupid to some degree for never seeing or never knowing this, although I realize it wasn't my path at that point, I guess. Um, the reality is this, that with honest scrutiny of the Bible, I've come to realize that our tradition about the Bible, our idea that we have in our minds about what the Bible is, might not actually be fully coherent with its actual content. And this is where the struggle is, to take the content on face value and in like an intellectual, honest look at the content, and then having to put that against what we do believe, what we've always believed about it. And some of the reasons why we've come to this crossroad in the last 150 years, I'm 150 years late, I guess, is because of new information that's become available to us. Archaeological evidence, the huge libraries of Nineveh and Ugarit, for instance, that have become available to us, that we've deciphered, and we can actually read, and I'll include Egypt there. We can read the writings of the people that were contemporaries of the Bible, and it casts a whole new light on all of that. Scholarship has developed quite a lot in the last 200, 150, 200 years. There's a lot of new information we have to process and bring in to our view about the Bible. All right, so I want to leave you here today. Next week, I'd like to go, and I would like to take each one of these axioms separately. So next week, I would like to have a look at why the Bible is not a book, and spend a bit of time in some examples on why it seems obvious to me that the Bible is not, in fact, a book that's put together with the idea that it's one univocal, inerrant piece of writing. Thanks so much for joining me today. Have a wonderful week. Cheers.